We're going to finish up chapter 7 of Hebrews and hopefully get into chapter 8 as well. I don't know about you, but for me, this is an interesting study, okay? I appreciate your patience getting in depth with it. Sometimes we study books and we just rush over things and we miss so much stuff. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time in the book of Hebrews. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible, and I think it's just because of the subject matter that's in there, and we don't talk about the subject matter quite as much. At the end of Hebrews 7, verses 17, around verse 12 through the end of the chapter or so, the writer is contrasting the Levitical priesthood with the priesthood of Melchizedek. And why is he doing that? Why is he even making this contrast? Why is he spending the time? Okay, yes, because he's writing to Hebrew Christians that are going back to Judaism, and he doesn't want them to go back. He wants them to stay in Christianity, and so he's trying to show them that Christianity is the superior religion. In every way, folks, okay? In every way. It doesn't matter what element of Judaism you talk about, whether you talk about the prophets, whether you talk about Moses, whether you talk about the rest in Canaan, whether you talk about the sacrifices, whether you talk about the tabernacle, it doesn't matter what it is. Jesus and Christianity are the better religion. Another thing before we get into the class I want to remind you about is this. Oftentimes the writer, who I believe is the Apostle Paul, but anyway, the inspired writer, he will introduce something very, very briefly, maybe in a statement, and you'll think, well, that's pretty cool, and then he'll just kind of leave it. And then all of a sudden he comes back and he spends an entire chapter talking about the thing that he introduced maybe 2 chapters before. And that's where we are right now. He's saying some things, and we'll make mention of them, and then he's going to come back in chapters 8, 9, and 10, and he just elaborates on what he introduced just with a sentence or two in chapter 6 and 7. And so I find that pretty interesting as well. What are some of the contrasts between the Levitical priests and Jesus as our high priest? What are some of the contrasts?
They will die.
Okay, very good. Yes, they will die. And they did die, didn't they? We may mention that there was somewhere between 78 to 85 high priests that occupied that office from the days of Aaron till the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So there was this constant changeover of the high priesthood. How long has the high priesthood of Jesus been in existence? Ooh, there's a question that you have to think about. How long? Right at 2,000 years, folks. Okay? When Jesus ascended back to the right hand of God, He entered into the Holy of Holies, didn't He? And He assumed His position as the high priest over the sanctuary and over the true tabernacle. And we're going to talk about those things tonight. So He's been there 2,000 years. How many times has that priesthood changed? Never. Now think about that. 85 changes in the Levitical priesthood, at least, and not one change in the priesthood of Melchizedek. He's been high priest, and he will continue high priest forever, won't he? And that priesthood will never change. What's another difference between the two priesthoods that we've already talked about?
His is absolute forgiveness, and theirs was periodic, I guess.
Okay, we've mentioned that. There was no perfection under the Levitical priesthood, was there? Okay, that law and the priesthood was not perfect, and but there is perfection. Jesus can save to the uttermost under this priesthood. Any other differences?
Sinfulness of the old priest versus sinlessness of Jesus.
Okay, well, that's where we are right now, isn't it? Okay, last week we ended talking about the sinlessness of Jesus. We haven't gotten into the sinfulness of the priest yet. That's what we're going to talk about. Remember that Jesus' priesthood was given by an oath from God, wasn't it? Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110, verse 4. There was no oath for those priests under the Levitical priesthood. It was established, and then they just assumed their responsibilities, one after another, upon the death of the high priest. But there was no oath given to them. So there's a lot of contrast that he's talking about.
Mainly the same families that the priesthood.
From Aaron.
Right? They didn't.
The Aaronic priesthood, yeah. They sprang from Aaron's family tree, but it was a constant change, wasn't it? Okay, but there's no oath given to those. So those are some of the differences that we've looked at. And last week, how was Jesus described? There were 5 descriptions that we talked about of Jesus last week as the high priest. He is... Okay, get them in order. Holy, okay? Second is harmless. Third, undefiled. Number 4, separate from sinners. And number 5, made higher than the heavens. Folks, those 5 statements separate Jesus from every human being. Now, was the office of high priest an important office under Judaism? And was the man who occupied that position looked upon with honor? Oh yes, extremely so. Okay? But guys, there's not one of those men, not one, including Aaron himself, that guess what? That can hold a candle to Jesus Christ. Okay? Can't hold a candle. There's no comparison whatsoever. And so he talks about the sinlessness of Jesus. And tonight, beginning in verse 27, he's going to talk about the sinfulness of these high priests. Listen to what he says. Who needeth not daily, as those priests, to offer up sacrifice for his own sins. Now he's talking about Jesus, but he's contrasting Jesus with whom? With the Levitical priest. He says Jesus doesn't have to do what those priests do. Those priests have to offer up a sacrifice for their own what? For their own sins. Okay? And then for the people's. For this he did once when he offered up himself. Let me give these guys over here. You go, guys. Pass those back to them. Thanks. Good stuff. Hate for people to sit there lost going, oh, wish they'd get some notes to me. Notice point A there, folks. The priesthood, the Levitical priest, had to offer up a personal sacrifice for their own sin. Notice one of the readings in Leviticus chapter 3, verse 4. If the priest that is anointed do sin, according to the sin of the people, let him bring for his sin, which he hath sinned, a young bullock without blemish unto the Lord for a sin offering. Wouldn't it be horrible to think that our Lord Jesus Christ had to bring a sin offering unto God before he could offer up himself as an offering for us? You just think, well, wait a minute. If you've got sin and you need a sacrifice for sin, then who are you to be offering sacrifices for my sin? There was a prayer of the high priest that was prayed before they offered the sacrifice for their sin. And here's what it says. O Lord, I have sinned and done wickedly and gone astray before thy face. I and my house and the sons of Aaron, the people of thy holiness. I beseech thee for thy name's sake, blot out the sins, iniquities, and transgressions by which, look at that, I have sinned. Wow. Done wickedly and gone astray before thy face. I and my house and the sons of Aaron, the people of thy holiness, as it is written in the law of Moses thy servant. On that day shall He make atonement for you to cleanse you, that ye may be clean from all your sins before the Lord. Man, here is a high priest who, before he offers that bullock, what does he do? He confesses his sin. And look how he describes himself. Did you see that? He says, I beseech thee for thy name's sake, blot out the sins, iniquities, and transgressions by which I have sinned and done what? Wickedly. Folks, he was no different than any other Hebrew, other than he held the office of high priest. That was the only distinction. He was just a what? He was just a man, wasn't he? And that's what we have in that next point. The high priest was a man like all other men, and he was subject to sinful passions to which he would sometimes yield. Thus, he needed forgiveness, as did all the people. So, you're looking at these two priesthoods, right? And he's holding up two individuals. He's holding up the high priest, a great man, a wonderful man, powerful man, and he holds up our high priest, Jesus Christ. You look at one, and what do you see? Sin, wickedness, corruption. A man who needs a sacrifice as bad as you do. And then he holds up Jesus. And what do you see? You see no sin. You see absolute perfection, absolute holiness. Now, folks, which high priest do you want to be your high priest? Oh, give me the old sinner. You'd be a foolish person to desire that, wouldn't you? And that's what he's trying to get these people to understand. Now, notice that he briefly, this is one of those times where I told you he just briefly mentioned something. This is what he says in the last part of the verse. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. He offered a sacrifice, what? Once. Okay? That's in contrast to what? The many sacrifices of the high priest. Here's something that I'd like to, that would be interesting to know. You know, how many times did Aaron, now remember he's the first high priest, right? And we kind of hold Aaron up in high esteem. Wouldn't you like to have a tally of how many times Aaron had to offer a bullock for himself before he offered a sacrifice for the people? Just Aaron. You think it may have been a lot? Folks, I bet you almost every time a priest made a sacrifice, before he did anything, he made his own sacrifice, don't you? Okay, so when he got out there to do sacrifices for the people, he had to get out there a few minutes early to take care of what? Take care of himself. Okay? And he may have had to do it on almost a daily basis, mightn't he? That's just one. Multiply it times 85 high priests. Just think of the hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of sacrifices of bulls and goats and lambs that were made just because the high priest had sinned. Jesus made a sacrifice not for himself but for the people. How many times? Just once. You see, when I talk about the multitude of sacrifices on behalf of the high priest, I'm not even talking about what they also did for the people. Guys, I bet you there were millions of sacrifices of animals, don't you? And Jesus made how many? One. Wow. Look at the definition of once. Upon one occasion only. I love that. Thayer says once. Waycaster says once without need or possibility of repetition. It means once, what? Finally. Folks, Jesus died one time and never had to what? Never had to die again. Wow, what a statement. Under the Levitical priesthood, neither in the nature of the offering nor in the character of those who made it, were there any sufficient reasons why it should cease to be offered. And it was therefore repeated day by day. Now think about what he says. He says there's two things that cause this offering to have to be offered over and over and over. Number one, the nature of the sacrifice. What was it? Animals. Now guys, I don't know about you. I do think I'm a little higher than a lamb. And maybe if you look at me just right, I'm a little prettier than a bullock. Now I realize that's in the eyes of the beholder. Okay? But, you know, just the nature of the sacrifice. They have no soul, do they? They have no conscience. And yet they're offered for a human's sin. Are they made in the image of God? Those animals aren't made in the image of God. And yet they're offered for us who are made in the image of God. The very nature of the sacrifice indicates what? It's going to have to be offered a whole bunch of times. And guess what it'll never do? It'll never measure up, will it? And then secondly, he says they have to be offered over and over and over because of the character of the person making the sacrifice. They're what? They're sinners. Wow. When you think about that, it shows you the weakness of what? The law of Moses, doesn't it? It was weak, folks. Okay? Now, it was God-given, yes, and it did what God wanted it to do, but it was weak and couldn't do some things that were desperately needed by mankind. Jesus' sacrifice was sufficient in all ways, and it was only needed what? Once. Now, guys, He's going to come back to this sacrifice in Hebrews chapter 10, and He's going to spend a lot of time on it, talking about it all. He's just going to expand on it all in a chapter, okay? Hebrews 7 verse 28 is a summary, okay? And it just summarizes a lot of what he has been saying in the end of this chapter. For the law maketh men high priests which have infirmity. But the word of the oath, wow, which was since the law, maketh the Son, who is consecrated forevermore. Guys, there's a ton of contrasts in that one little statement. Here's something. Have y'all ever heard of a preacher saying, today I'm going to preach to you out of the word of the oath? Have you ever heard that said? I've never heard that said. And yet, at least 2 times in Hebrews, that's the way he refers to what? The New Testament, the word of the oath. Wow. Okay? That's how important that oath that God made to those Old Testament individuals in Psalm 110 is important. That's the word of the oath. The old law wasn't the word of the oath. So look at the contrast. Law versus word of the oath. He doesn't state anything about their not having an oath, but he does talk about the oath. One involved men, the other involves the Son. The old law, they had what? Infirmity, not Jesus. Jesus was what? Consecrated how long? Forevermore. Not those Old Testament priests. They had to what? They had to die. And so it amazes me in one little verse how concise he can summarize everything he's been talking about. Isn't it amazing? You want to know how he does that? He's just smart, ain't he? No. He's what? He's inspired of God. And God, in one little verse, can encapsulate the totality of everything that he's been talking about. Don't you wish we had the ability to do that? And notice that he says that Jesus is consecrated forevermore. That little word consecrated means to complete, to accomplish, to consummate, to make perfect. Jesus' priesthood is permanent, lasting, and what? Unchangeable, folks. Wow. What priesthood are we living under? We don't have a priesthood in the church, Vic. Yes, we do. What priesthood are we under? The priesthood of Melchizedek. That's whose priesthood. Who is our high priest? Jesus, folks. The same things he told those Jews apply to us today. Do you know that? See, we don't talk about this stuff enough. You and I need to rejoice. You know, if anybody asks, do y'all have a priesthood in the Church of Christ? What do we need to say? Yes. Yes, we do. You do? Yeah, we sure do. Do you have a high priest? Absolutely we have a high priest. Best high priest you could ever imagine. How many have you had? Well, for 2,000 years, we've only had one. Well, people think you about nuts, wouldn't they? And here's something that'll really astound you. I am a priest. Bet you didn't know that. And aren't we? He's made us kings and priests forever. Okay, every one of us are priests. Under who? Our high priest, Jesus Christ. And folks, we need to tell people that. We don't need to be ashamed of it. It is a spiritual priesthood, and we need to shout it to the world that we have one and not be ashamed. And the writer here is talking about it. Questions, comments?